Welcome to Manibil, and welcome to part, who knows, of my series of deconstructions of David Hume's book, A Treatise of Human Nature. We are at section 8 in part 3, I think. I get a little lost in all these parts. And it is of the causes of belief. And he starts out by saying, having thus explained the nature of belief, I just have to add that I, first of all, don't care too much about belief. That might be a weakness of mine, but I have never had any kind of religious belief of any kind. I don't adhere to any isms. I'm not interested in politics, right? There's nothing about my everyday where I have to say, I have to believe in this to be the case or something like that, right? I just don't. So I'm interested in what I can know. And you might, criticize me for saying, okay, then what do you mean by knowing? And of course, I would need to define that and base that on my ontology/metaphysics, right? But to frame it another way, what I'm really interested in is what is interesting and important about my experience. And I would say that which is important about my experience could be labeled as knowledge, right? All the other things are also important, but that is a particular aspect of my experience, which I would call knowledge, I find of a particular significance and importance. One way to phrase it might be the deepest insight into what might be beyond my experiences, if I consider that my experience be some kind of representation of an outside, right? Which I do consider. I work from that axiom, if you haven't heard that before. So beliefs, what are those, right? I know he's trying to get at possibly Christians and other people who are sort of caught up in their own fancy, right? Though you might point out correctly that Plato talked about justified true belief, and there might be some confusion about what is meant by belief, and I would be willing to accept that there is this confusion, and I might be confused about it also. If I say that I believe that my car is in front of my house, even though I can't see it right now, I wouldn't consider that a belief, because then I would mix up what I consider, unless somebody ran away with it, right, or drove it away or stole it, then it would stand out there in its parking spot where I usually leave it, right? And I don't consider that a belief. That is just a memory as such, right? It's just a memory which I'm constantly basing particular events or decisions or so on my day on, right? I wouldn't consider that a belief, and therefore I don't like the term belief being used in epistemology in sort of the Platonic version, right? Belief is more like, I believe in Santa Claus, right? I choose to believe in Santa Claus. I choose to believe in whatever, right? Something that is sort of beyond normal approach, right? Then it's sort of a belief. It's sort of some imagined stuff. I actually choose to treat it if it was a direct impression. And I'm not sure if is the same definition that or explanation that Hume has come up with, because I have to admit, I, first of all, as I said, is not really interested in the topic itself, and he feels very long-winded about it, and I'm not sure why it needs to be so long-winded, but there might be some aspects of belief that needs a lot of clarification, and it's perfectly justified what Hume is doing. Fine. I mean, give me a comment. Let me know what you think. Let me know if there's something I should take seriously, according to your understanding, that for some reason that I've overlooked, that might, when you're concerned with my philosophy, and you think, well, if you think that way, you might consider this, which is discussing in this chapter on belief. Well, let me know, right? But in any case, the next sections here in this part of his philosophy I will probably go through quite quickly unless there's something that catches my eye, because I find it quite boring, this topic, and I wanted to sort of to get it over with, right? But I don't want just to jump over it because there might be something of interest, right? So I'm sort of a completist in some way or another, right? Okay, let's head in.
File 23 of A Treatise of Human Nature by David Hume, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by George Yeager. Book 1, Part 3, Section 8 of the Causes of Belief. Having thus explained the nature of belief, and shewn that it consists in a lively idea related to a present impression, let us now proceed to examine from what principles it is derived and what bestows the vivacity on the idea. I would willingly establish it as a general maxim.
I was just thinking about the terms he used by force and vivacity about impressions and ideas. I think that by vivacity is liveliness, but that is sort of could be understood as maybe how it moves or something like that. It's liveliness, it's force, it's sort of how strong is the impression, so to say, right? How strong is the sensation? The vivacity is how lively is it, right? If I imagine a polar bear, I just imagine sort of standing still or something like that, right? I might imagine it somehow jumping around and moving about, but it's not lively in the same sense as if I'm actually experiencing polar bear, right? So that's just a thought, right? So just occurred to me earlier today.
In the science of human nature, that when any impression becomes present to us, it not only transports the mind to such ideas as are related to it, but likewise communicates to them a share of its force and vivacity. All the operations of the mind depend in a great measure on its disposition when it performs them. And according as the spirits are more or less elevated, and the attention more or less fixed, the action will always have more or less vigor and vivacity. When, therefore, any object is presented which elevates and enlivens the thought, every action to which the mind applies itself will be more strong and vivid, as long as that disposition continues. Now, it is evident the continuance of the disposition depends entirely on the objects about which the mind is employed, and that any new object naturally gives a new direction to the spirits and changes the disposition, as on the contrary, when the mind fixes constantly on the same object or passes easily and insensibly along related objects, the disposition has a much longer duration. Hence it happens that when the mind is once enlivened by a present impression, it proceeds to form a more lively idea of the related objects by a natural transition of the disposition from the one to the other. The change of the objects is so easy that the mind is scarce sensible of it, but applies itself to the conception of the related idea with all the force and vivacity it acquired from the present impression. If, in considering the nature of relation and that facility of transition which is essential to it, we can satisfy ourselves concerning the reality of this phenomenon, it is well. But I must confess I place my chief confidence in experience to prove so material a principle. We may therefore observe, as the first experiment to our present purpose, that upon the appearance of the picture of an absent friend, our idea of him is evidently enlivened by the resemblance, and that every passion which that idea occasions, whether of joy or sorrow, acquires new force and vigor. In producing this effect, there concur both a relation and a present impression. Where the picture bears him no resemblance, or at least was not intended for him, it never so much as conveys our thought to him. And where it is absent, as well as the person, though the mind may pass from the thought of the one to that of the other, it feels its idea to be rather weakened than enlivened by that transition. We take a pleasure in viewing the picture of a friend when it is set before us, but when it is removed, rather choose to consider him directly than by reflection in an image which is equally distant and obscure. The ceremonies of the Roman Catholic religion may be considered as experiments of the same nature. The devotees of that strange superstition usually plead in excuse of the mummeries with which they are upbraided, that they feel the good effect of those external motions and postures and actions in enlivening their devotion and quickening their fervor, which otherwise would decay away if directed entirely to distant and immaterial objects. We shadow out the objects of our faith, say they, in sensible types and images, and render them more present to us by the immediate presence of these types than it is possible for us to do merely by an intellectual view and contemplation. Sensible objects have always a greater influence on the fancy than any other, and this influence they readily convey to those ideas to which they are related and which they resemble. I shall only infer from these practices and this reasoning that the effect of resemblance in enlivening the idea is very common, and as in every case a resemblance and a present impression must concur, we are abundantly supplied with experiments to prove the reality of the foregoing principle. We may add force to these experiments by others of a different kind in considering the effects of contiguity as well as of resemblance. It is certain that distance diminishes the force of every idea, and that upon our approach to any object, though it does not discover itself to our senses, it operates upon the mind with an influence that imitates an immediate impression. The thinking on any object readily transports the mind to what is contiguous, but it is only the actual presence of an object that transports it with a superior vivacity. When I am a few miles from home, whatever relates to it touches me more nearly than when I am 200 leagues distant, though even at that distance, the reflecting on anything in the neighborhood of my friends and family naturally produces an idea of them. But as in this latter case, both the objects of the mind are ideas, notwithstanding there is an easy transition betwixt them, that transition alone is not able to give a superior vivacity to any of the ideas for want of some immediate impression. Footnote 6. Reader's note. The Latin quotation from Cicero De Finibus, Book 5, is not read here because it is translated to English immediately following. End of footnote 6. Reader's note. The text's translation of Cicero. Should I, he said, attribute to instinct or to some kind of illusion, the fact that when we see those places in which we are told notable men spent much of their time, we are more powerfully affected than when we hear of the exploits of the men themselves or read something written. This is just what is happening to me now, for I am reminded of Plato, who, we are told, was the first to make a practice of holding discussions here. Those gardens of his nearby do not merely put me in mind of him. They seem to set the man himself before my very eyes. Speusippus was here, so was Xenocrates, so was his pupil Polemo, and that very seat which we may view was his. Then again, when I looked at our Senate House, I mean the old building of Hostilius, not this new one. When it was enlarged, it diminished in my estimation. I used to think of Scipio, Cato, Laelius, and in particular of my own grandfather. Such is the power of places to evoke associations. So it is with good reason that they are used as a basis for memory training. Reader's note: end of the text's translation of Cicero. No one can doubt but causation has the same influence as the other two relations of resemblance and contiguity. Superstitious people are fond of the relics of saints and holy men for the same reason that they seek after types and images, in order to enliven their devotion and give them a more intimate and strong conception of those exemplary lives which they desire to imitate. Now, it is evident one of the best relics a devotee could procure would be the handiwork of a saint. And if his clothes and furniture are ever to be considered in this light, it is because they were once at his disposal and were moved and effected by him, in which respect they are to be considered as imperfect effects, and as connected with him by a shorter chain of consequences than any of those from which we learn the reality of his existence. This phenomenon clearly proves that a present impression with a relation of causation may enliven any idea, and consequently produce belief or assent, according to the precedent definition of it. But why need we seek for other arguments to prove that a present impression with a relation or transition of the fancy may enliven any idea, when this very instance of our reasonings from cause and effect will alone suffice to that purpose? It is certain we must have an idea of every matter of fact which we believe. It is certain that this idea arises only from a relation to a present impression. It is certain that the belief superadds nothing to the idea, but only changes our manner of conceiving it and renders it more strong and lively. The present conclusion concerning the influence of relation is the immediate consequence of all these steps, and every step appears to me sure and infallible. There enters nothing into this operation of the mind but a present impression, a lively idea, and a relation or association in the fancy betwixt the impression and idea, so that there can be no suspicion of mistake. In order to put this whole affair in a fuller light, let us consider it as a question in natural philosophy which we must determine by experience and observation. I suppose there is an object presented from which I draw a certain conclusion and form to myself ideas which I am said to believe or assent to. Here it is evident that however that object which is present to my senses and that other whose existence I infer by reasoning, may be thought to influence each other by their particular powers or qualities. Yet as the phenomenon of belief, which we at present examine, is merely internal, these powers and qualities, being entirely unknown, can have no hand in producing it. It is the present impression which is to be considered as the true and real cause of the idea, and of the belief which attends it. We must therefore endeavor to discover by experiments the particular qualities by which it is enabled to produce so extraordinary an effect. First, then, I observe that the present impression has not this effect by its own proper power and efficacy, and when considered alone as a single perception limited to the present moment. I find that an impression from which, on its first appearance, I can draw no conclusion, may afterwards become the foundation of belief when I have had experience of its usual consequences. We must in every case have observed the same impression in past instances, and have found it to be constantly conjoined with some other impression. This is confirmed by such a multitude of experiments that it admits not of the smallest doubt. From a second observation, I conclude that the belief which attends the present impression and is produced by a number of past impressions and conjunctions, that this belief, I say, arises immediately, without any new operation of the reason or imagination. Of this I can be certain, because I never am conscious of any such operation, and find nothing in the subject on which it can be founded. Now, as we call everything custom which proceeds from a past repetition without any new reasoning or conclusion, we may establish it as a certain truth that all the belief which follows upon any present impression is derived solely from that origin. When we are accustomed to see two impressions conjoined together, the appearance or idea of the one immediately carries us to the idea of the other. Being fully satisfied on this head, I make a third set of experiments in order to know whether anything be requisite beside the customary transition towards the production of this phenomenon of belief. I therefore change the first impression into an idea, and observe that though the customary transition to the correlative idea still remains, yet there is in reality no belief nor persuasion. A present impression, then, is absolutely requisite to this whole operation, and when, after this, I compare an impression with an idea, and find that their only difference consists in their different degrees of force and vivacity, I conclude, upon the whole, that belief is a more vivid and intense conception of an idea, proceeding from its relation to a present impression. Thus, all probable reasoning is nothing but a species of sensation. It is not solely in poetry and music we must follow our taste and sentiment, but likewise in philosophy. When I am convinced of any principle, it is only an idea which strikes more strongly upon me. When I give the preference to one set of arguments above another, I do nothing but decide from my feeling concerning the superiority of their influence. Objects have no discoverable connection together, nor is it from any other principle but custom operating upon the imagination that we can draw any inference from the appearance of one to the existence of another. It will here be worth our observation that the past experience on which all our judgments concerning cause and effect depend may operate on our mind in such an insensible manner as never to be taken notice of, and may even in some measure be unknown to us. A person who stops short in his journey upon meeting a river in his way foresees the consequences of his proceeding forward, and his knowledge of these consequences is conveyed to him by past experience, which informs him of such certain conjunctions of causes and effects. But can we think that on this occasion he reflects on any past experience, and calls to remembrance instances that he has seen or heard of in order to discover the effects of water on animal bodies? No, surely this is not the method in which he proceeds in his reasoning. The idea of sinking is so closely connected with that of water, and the idea of suffocating with that of sinking, that the mind makes the transition without the assistance of the memory. The custom operates before we have time for reflection. The objects seem so inseparable that we interpose not a moment's delay in passing from the one to the other. But as this transition proceeds from experience, and not from any primary connection betwixt the ideas, we must necessarily acknowledge that experience may produce a belief and a judgment of causes and effects by a secret operation and without being once thought of. This removes all pretext, if there yet remains any, for asserting that the mind is convinced by reasoning of that principle that instances of which we have no experience must necessarily resemble those of which we have. For we here find that the understanding or imagination can draw inferences from past experience without reflecting on it, much more without forming any principle concerning it or reasoning upon that principle. In general, we may observe that in all the most established and uniform conjunctions of causes and effects, such as those of gravity, impulse.
I was screwing around with the ebook, trying to find where we were in the text in the audiobook. Now we have found it. We are here, just about. So sorry about that.
Solidity, etc. The mind never carries its view expressly to consider any past experience, though in other associations of objects, which are more rare and unusual, it may assist the custom and transition of ideas by this reflection. Nay, we find in some cases that the reflection produces the belief without the custom, or more properly speaking, that the reflection produces the custom in an oblique and artificial manner. I explain myself. It is certain that not only in philosophy, but even in common life, we may attain the knowledge of a particular cause merely by one experiment, provided it be made with judgment, and after a careful removal of all foreign and superfluous circumstances. Now, as after one experiment of this kind, the mind upon the appearance either of the cause or the effect can draw an inference concerning the existence of its correlative, and as a habit can never be acquired merely by one instance, it may be thought that belief cannot in this case be esteemed the effect of custom. But this difficulty will vanish if we consider that though we are here supposed to have had only one experiment of a particular effect, yet we have many millions to convince us of this principle, that like objects placed in like circumstances will always produce like effects. And as this principle has established itself by a sufficient custom, it bestows an evidence and firmness on any opinion to which it can be applied. The connection of the ideas is not habitual after one experiment, but this connection is comprehended under another principle that is habitual, which brings us back to our hypothesis. In all cases, we transfer our experience to instances of which we have no experience, either expressly or tacitly, either directly or indirectly. I must not conclude this subject without observing that it is very difficult to talk of the operations of the mind with perfect propriety and exactness, because common language has seldom made any very nice distinctions among them, but has generally called by the same term all such as nearly resemble each other. And as this is a source almost inevitable of obscurity and confusion in the author, so it may frequently give rise to doubts and objections in the reader, which otherwise he would never have dreamed of. Thus, my general position, that an opinion or belief is nothing but a strong and lively idea derived from a present impression related to it, may be liable to the following objection by reason of a little ambiguity in those words strong and lively. It may be said that not only an impression may give rise to reasoning, but that an idea may also have the same influence, especially upon my principle that all our ideas are derived from correspondent impressions. For suppose I form at present an idea of which I have forgot the correspondent impression. I am able to conclude from this idea that such an impression did once exist, and as this conclusion is attended with belief, it may be asked from whence are the qualities of force and vivacity derived which constitute this belief. And to this I answer very readily, from the present idea. For as this idea is not here considered as the representation of any absent object, but as a real perception in the mind of which we are intimately conscious, it must be able to bestow on whatever is related to it the same quality, call it firmness or solidity or force or vivacity, with which the mind reflects upon it, and is assured of its present existence. The idea here supplies the place of an impression and is entirely the same so far as regards our present purpose. Upon the same principles, we need not be surprised to hear of the remembrance of an idea, that is, of the idea of an idea, and of its force and vivacity superior to the loose conceptions of the imagination. In thinking of our past thoughts, we not only delineate out the objects of which we were thinking, but also conceive the action of the mind in the meditation, that certain je ne sais quoi, of which it is impossible to give any definition or description, but which everyone sufficiently understands. When the memory offers an idea of this and represents it as past, it is easily conceived how that idea may have more vigor and firmness than when we think of a past thought of which we have no remembrance. After this, anyone will understand how we may form the idea of an impression and of an idea, and how we may believe the existence of an impression and of an idea. End of file 23.
Okay, this is seriously dry stuff, in my opinion. First of all, as I say, it's not a topic that I feel much attachment to in any regard. and I don't find it particularly useful in philosophy, other than maybe to point out its lack of use, maybe. And maybe that's to some extent what Hume is trying to go for, right? I wouldn't hesitate other than a guess in that regard. Though I would like to point out that he repeats here very strictly, my principle. He says, my principle, all our ideas. Now, he might simplify or specify this, that all my ideas are derived from correspondent impression. He cannot get access to other people's minds. So he cannot say other than via a built-in implied axiom. I am working from the axiom that other individuals have minds, and within those minds, in those minds, it has the ontology that is similar to mine, which is all the ideas are derived from correspondent impressions. I will take that, my approach might be a slightly more modern approach to these kinds of things. So, but I know what he means, right? So I'm not going to blame him for that. But it's very clear here, he has a principle that all our ideas are derived from correspondent impressions. He might want to qualify it a bit and say all our simple ideas are derived from correspondent impression. Because if you can imagine a complex idea, that complex idea, like the 17-legged orange polar bear, haven't been experienced yet, though the particular substrates or the particular subunits, subconcepts like leg and orange or quail and so on, can each of them be experienced as simpler ideas, right? But the combination of them into a complex idea can be imagined, like the unicorn, right? Without them necessarily having been impressed. So, but it's very clear and precise sufficiently for me that it's very clearly stated here, right? My principle is all ideas are derived from correspondent impressions. I like that. And then he gave a nudge to, if I can find it again, here, a nudge to the Roman Catholic religion. He says, the ceremonies of the Roman Catholic religion may be considered as experiments of the same nature. The devotees of that strange superstition usually plead in excuse of the mummeries with which they are upbraided, that they feel the good effect of those external motions and postures and actions in enlivening their devotion and quickening their fervor, which otherwise would decay away if directed entirely to distant immaterial objects. So, if you have an imagination of some kind, you not like to see some kind of manifestation of it, right? And this is the problem of imagination. Because a belief is something that is imagined, but you want that to actually be a part of your existence, part of your world, even though you haven't had the impression yet. And moreover, in the cases that I mentioned, that with religion which has been force-fed to you since childhood, and you have been threatened with murder and death and getting grilled by the devil and who knows what, right? If you don't adhere to it, then you would very much like to be in accordance with the teachings, so you don't step in the wrong direction, right? And then when you are there and sitting listening to the whatever dude, filling your head with weirdness, that you are surrounded in something that gives you an emotion that you feel fits the bill somehow, right? Sort of something along those lines that Hume is going for, right? But my takeaway is that he's sort of stabbing at the ridiculousness of it, right? And it's something that would be maybe easier to do in a place like Scotland, but he was, criticized and even had to flee at some point, I think, in order to avoid this sort of unholy philosophy, right? And but 100 years before with Spinoza, who was basically ostracized from, nobody wanted to talk to him because he was not sufficiently believer, right? And therefore, maybe in that sense of religion, belief has the notion of a statement. I am willing to say to you, I'm going with the stories you tell me without me being able to check whether or not it is the case. Like God is always placed in the heavens where you can't go, right? Hell is down below the earth, where you can't go and check, right? It's always somewhere where you can't go and check. So you have to stay in belief and, but what's it called? Suspension of disbelief. What's it called, right? Your disbelief has to be removed, and you just have to accept, okay, I guess I have to follow along, otherwise I'll be kicked to the curb, right? So these are sort of my takeaways from this very, very long and dry chapter. That is, in my, it's very much something that is on his mind. Apparently, this belief thing that he really wants to push away, but he is also sort of being very wordy about it, and dry to a very large extent that I can't be bothered with it, to be honest, right? So the next one is of the effects of other relations and other habits, and we will have them in the next chapter. See you there.